Until the mid-1970s, most of the world had never heard the word cocaine. There was simply no demand for the mass production, distribution, and consumption of cocaine. But that soon changed. Everyone knew about cocaine. It made you feel amazing, and you could stay awake for days and feel like a superhero. This kind of pleasure was costly, so you could make a lot of money from selling cocaine. The biggest market was, of course, in America, and very soon cocaine was flooding the country. One of the most famous drug lords was considered to be Pablo Escobar, but there was someone else who worked closely with not only Escobar, but many other cocaine suppliers. This man was the first to use an airplane to transport drugs and transported tons of cocaine to America. This man was a partner of the famous drug lord Carlos Enrique Lehder. He was even apologized to by the police when they caught him transporting 660 pounds of marijuana. This man's name was George Jung. He also became famous for the movie Blow, which came out in 2001. His character was wonderfully played by Johnny Depp. The movie was not a box office success, but it gained a large number of fans, and many people were deeply involved in the story of George Jung. The movie distorts many of his life moments, but the life of this successful drug dealer was definitely unforgettable and exciting. But did everything end as sadly as in the movie? George Jacob Jung was born on August 6, 1942, in Boston. His family then moved to Weymouth, Massachusetts, where his father owned a business. Things were not going well for his father. Money was always in short supply, but the family had all the essentials. Still, as a child, George decided there was no way he would be poor. George was not the ablest student in school, but he played soccer very well. He had the makings of a true leader, both on and off the field. Although George was a pretty average guy and not a bully, his first trip to jail happened when he was still in high school. He was arrested for soliciting a prostitute who turned out to be an undercover cop. George would end up going to jail more than just once. Nevertheless, he was able to graduate from high school and enrolled at the University of Southern Mississippi, where he planned to earn a degree in advertising. Never able to finish his studies because he was very soon introduced to something that would determine his entire destiny. It was marijuana. George and his friend soon moved to Manhattan Beach, California, for a better life. Everything was different here. Sunshine, beaches, beautiful girls, and a bright and freeing atmosphere. They needed a lot of money to enjoy it all and smoke the weed they loved so much. One option was to sell some of the marijuana they were buying, but that would hardly make any serious money. It didn't take long for the guys to figure it out. An old friend who had come to Manhattan Beach for the summer helped them out. The friends threw a party, and, of course, a lot of marijuana was involved. A big bowl of their favorite product was on the table, and one of the friends who arrived couldn't refuse the temptation. The weed impressed him. It was very good indeed. The friend asked how much it cost, and when he found out that it could be bought for only $60 a kilo, he said that on the East Coast it would cost 5 times as much. That was a lot of money at the time, but it left the question of how to get the marijuana across hundreds of miles without losing money. Stuffing suitcases with pot, George's girlfriend, who was a stewardess, transported them to Amherst, Massachusetts. The weed quickly sold out, and the net profit from each kilogram was $200. It was a success. It was a success that had to be built upon, and the market on the East Coast was truly bottomless. Supplies began to increase more and more, and gradually they began to grow into a good business. George Jung became a well-known weed dealer in the East, and the money poured in like a river. George was young and spent it on the good life, parties, and girls. Still, the money wasn't good enough for him. George bought weed from middlemen in California, who set their own prices and rules. He realized he had to work without middlemen, directly with the supplier. The only question was where to find these suppliers. George went to Mexico without knowing a word of Spanish. George knew nothing about Mexico, didn't know Spanish, and most importantly, didn't know where to find the marijuana supplier. It was a trip at random. George had seen a movie called Night of the Iguana with Liz Taylor and Richard Burton. and heard it was filmed in Puerto Vallarta. Ironically enough, that's the area he chose to go to. George and his friends were there for 2 weeks, but they couldn't fulfill their goals, and their lack of Spanish slowed them down. In the end, the friends began to realize that it wouldn't work, and they wanted to go back home. On their last day, they met an American hippie girl who agreed to give them a ride. Who would have thought that this particular girl behind the wheel of a yellow Volkswagen Beetle would be their salvation? As they talked, the girl told them that she lived with a Mexican guy who had what George needed, a lot of what he needs. Next thing you know, they meet him, and he turns out to be the son of a Mexican general. He was a little crazy, but he did what was needed. He sold George many kilos of weed at $20 a kilo. In California, on the other hand, George was buying weed for $60 a kilo through intermediaries. The deal was a success. All that remained was transporting the marijuana to the States. An airplane was used for this purpose. Being an adrenaline junkie, Jung decided to take the first flight himself, even though he had very little flying experience. As expected, the flight was difficult, and George's inexperience nearly ruined the transportation operation and himself. He lost his way over the Pacific Ocean and was about 100 miles off course. It was getting dark, and George didn't know where he was flying. It was getting scary. George turned east and spotted a mountain pass, which became a landmark and an escape. After a while, the plane arrived at its destination, and Jung vowed never to transport cargo on a plane again without professional pilots. It was a whole other level of money-making. The business was flourishing. George and his friends rented a villa on the beach in Puerto Vallarta and started making about $50,000 to $100,000 a month. They usually made 2 trips a month. In addition to delivering marijuana by plane to California, they had to drive a motorhome another 3 days east to Amherst. The business was quite labor-intensive, but no one complained. They were young and full of ambition. In 1974, the business came to an end. George was arrested with 660 pounds marijuana in Chicago at the Playboy Club, waiting to hand over the drugs. The man who was supposed to meet him was connected to heroin and, to mitigate his sentence, gave up George's name. Surprisingly, the federal agents were not very interested in arresting him. They said, "We're sorry, we really don't want to bust pot people, but this is tied into a heroin operation and we have to arrest you." Jung was convicted and sent to a federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut. Who knew that prison would make George a millionaire and a real expert smuggler? Only it would not be marijuana, but a far more serious drug, cocaine. Danbury Prison proved to be a surprising place. George was surrounded by intelligent, eloquent businessmen who had somehow broken the law. Among them were bankers, lawyers, doctors, and smugglers. There you could more or less learn everything you needed to know about illegal activities, and it was the most authentic school of crime. It was here that George met the man who would turn his life upside down. This man's name was Carlos Lehder. Carlos was from Colombia, well-mannered, well-dressed, and spoke good English. He had been in prison for stealing cars, but he wasn't really interested in cars. In prison, he was developing an ambitious plan to make millions of dollars. While in prison, Carlos was looking for a way to get cocaine out of Colombia and for people to sell it in the United States. His prison bunkmate was George, who was a master smuggler and had considerable experience in transporting marijuana. It was like a marriage made in heaven. The man Carlos was so actively looking for ended up in the same cell with him. By transporting marijuana, George did not think he was doing anything illegal or wrong. No one made any negative statements about marijuana. George convinced himself that he simply satisfied a need that all young people wanted. Jung knew he was breaking the law, but he thought the law was wrong. Morally, he thought pot was okay. George had a very different attitude toward heroin, seeing it as an evil that he would never agree to transport. Carlos Lehder talked about a completely different drug, not marijuana or heroin. In America at the time, few people knew about cocaine. It was almost impossible to get, and almost no one knew what a remarkable effect the drug could produce. The market was free, and in the long run, it was crazy, unrealistic money. George knew nothing about cocaine and wasn't too eager to get into it. Everything turned over in his head when he discovered how much money could be made on the drug. Carlos told him that in Colombia, 1 kilo of cocaine cost $4,000 to $5,000. In the US, a kilo could sell for $60,000. The numbers turned George's head. He could earn several times more in one flight than he had in all the years he had transported marijuana. There was no more doubt, and 2 inmates began to work out a plan that would later bring them millions of dollars. Every day for a year, George and Carlos worked diligently on every detail. Lehder tried to make the most of his time in prison, talking to bankers and smugglers and meticulously studying every little detail that might be useful for his plan. He was obsessed with knowledge. It was only a matter of time before he got out of prison and into action. In 1975, George Jung and Carlos Lehder were released from prison. While still in prison, they agreed that when Carlos arrived in Colombia, he would send a telegram to the home of George's parents. Over the phone, they arranged for George to find 2 girls to transport the cocaine in suitcases from Antigua to the United States. It took George several days to find 2 rather naive girls. They liked the idea of having a little fun in Antigua and were not at all frightened by the fact that they would be smuggling drugs in their suitcases. The girls knew absolutely nothing about cocaine. Luckily for everyone, the operation was a success. The girls delivered the cocaine without any problems and enjoyed their time with George and Carlos so much that they returned to Antigua and transported the suitcases of drugs again. It was a resounding success. Now the business needed to be scaled up, and for this, an airplane was needed. Previously, cocaine could only be brought in suitcases or luggage, which was a much less efficient method with a higher probability of being caught. An airplane would make transportation much easier and greatly multiply the profits, so one was soon purchased. After hiring a professional pilot, George and Carlos started using the Bahamas as a loading station. It turned out that transporting cocaine by plane to the United States was not difficult, and it was easy money, so the number of flights began to increase. Even though the partners were making millions, they needed more money, and therefore more cocaine. Soon, George Jung met a man who would become the most famous drug lord in history, Pablo Escobar. The Colombian drug lords were struck by how cleverly Carlos Lehder and George Jung were transporting and selling drugs to the United States. The Colombians had plenty of cocaine, but there were many difficulties getting it to America. It was up to George to relieve them of these complications. Arrangements were made instantly, and Carlos and George began shipping vast quantities of drugs from Colombia to the States. Their business became the backbone of the infamous Medellin cartel. There was a routine to their smuggling operation. On Friday night, a plane would fly from the Bahamas to Escobar's ranch in Colombia and stay there overnight. On Saturday, the plane would return to the Bahamas. On Sunday afternoon, hidden among the herd of heavy air traffic departing the Caribbean for the mainland, a lone dot on the radar becomes lost among all the other dots. The plane would remain unnoticed before it finally descended below radar detection and landed on the mainland. By the late 1970s, the cartel was supplying about 80% of all the cocaine in the United States, thanks to Jung's planes and connections. The money poured in like a river. The money came back packed in Chevy Blazers exported from the United States to Colombia. Carlos had an estate in Colombia, a dealership, and he would buy Chevy Blazers in the United States, and then the money would be put into the door panels and other places of the car. Cocaine became an accepted product, as did marijuana. Snorting cocaine was somewhat considered normal, especially if you had a high income. The government unknowingly allowed the media and the recording and movie industries to promote cocaine. No one ever said no to it. Cocaine was considered a fantastic, miraculous drug that gave an enormous energy boost. You could stay awake for days and feel really high. It was like marijuana, only many times better. But in the end, everyone soon found out how evil it really was. The evil flooded all over America, and the supply only increased each time. George Jung, aka Boston George, and Carlos Lehder were in on it like no other. Soon their partnership would come to an end. Carlos Lehder was a fan of John Lennon and Adolf Hitler at the same time. He wasn't crazy, but he showed many signs of not being the most reliable partner. All was well at first, but once he started making tens of millions of dollars, the money and access to whatever he wanted clouded his mind. He first bought the small Bahamian island of Norman's Cay for $4.5 million. Small, single-engine planes couldn't carry cargo from Colombia to the U.S. without refueling, so a transshipment base halfway around the world was needed. The island was the perfect distance, 340 kilometers off the Florida coast. Norman's Cay allowed the supply of cocaine to increase several times over. The money became very plentiful. Carlos forced every resident to leave their homes on the small island. Some of them were able to be sent away for a bribe, and some were killed. Power overwhelmed his mind, and greed for money forced him to bid farewell to his longtime partner, George Jung. In fact, it was a good sign for Boston George. He didn't like the way Lehder had started the business. George thought the purchase of Norman's Cay Island was the wrong move, believing that only a man on the move would never get caught. He was beginning to be frightened by the crazy thoughts of Carlos, who was seriously considering taking over the country of Belize. George saw that the more money Carlos had, the more he began to save money by hiring unreliable, cheap pilots. The island, which for 4 years would be the main conduit for Colombian cocaine into the United States, was becoming a crazy drug den. They were doing whatever they wanted there, absolute madness. In addition, Carlos, always under the influence of cocaine, began to trust random, small-time fraudsters. He was always at risk of being conned, and overall, these fraudsters ended up playing a part in the breakdown of all partnership agreements between George Jung and Carlos Lehder. Now, the next question that needed to be answered was, how could George continue making money? And money never became an issue. Boston George continued to communicate closely with Pablo Escobar. Moreover, now that George was even closer to the Colombian drug lord, he didn't need to worry too much about any threat to his life. Just in case Carlos Lehder ever wanted to kill him, Jung was receiving independent supplies and was still shipping cocaine to the United States, only now without his longtime partner. Working directly with Escobar, as it turned out, was no less crazy than working with Carlos. During one visit to Medellin, Jung saw Escobar execute a man right in front of him. They were sitting at a table on the patio. When he saw that the two bodyguards had brought a snitch to the ranch, Pablo apologized to George, walked over to the man, and executed him. After that, he calmly returned to the table. He just looked at George and said, "He betrayed me." Then Pablo asked what Boston George wanted for dinner, as if nothing had happened. Another time, George witnessed Escobar's men throwing someone off a hotel balcony. Most likely, these showdowns were done on purpose so that George could see what Escobar was capable of doing to traitors. What he witnessed brought success, and Boston George realized he would never betray Pablo. He also finally realized how different the cocaine business was from the marijuana business. The marijuana business was done with a handshake, there was a trust factor, and the cocaine business was done with a gun. There was a sense of constant danger, and everyone in the business had a gun ready to go off at any moment. The enormous amount of money from the cocaine business turned many people's heads. George hated the violence that was going on around this business, so he tried to act calmly and carefully. He could have left the business at any time, but the love of risk prevented him from doing so. By 1987, George Jung had $100 million and paid minimal taxes thanks to an offshore account in Panama. He lived in a luxury mansion in Massachusetts, attended parties with celebrities, and had the most beautiful women and the best cars. He was a cocaine star, and stars, as we know, tend to shine brightly. The DEA couldn't help but know who George Jung was, and his house was under surveillance. It was only a matter of time before Boston George was behind bars again. In 1987, cops broke into his house at night, anticipating finding kilos of cocaine, but they were disappointed. There were only 3 or 4 ounces of cocaine in the house, but it was enough to make an arrest. The last thing George saw was his 1-year-old daughter being taken away by a police officer. Boston George wasn't planning on being in jail for more than 5 years. Given the very small dose of cocaine found in his house, he had reason to believe so. George was offered a deal to reduce his sentence if he testified against his old companion, Carlos Lehder. Jung remembered what Pablo Escobar had done to snitches, so he instantly refused. Soon, Carlos Lehder himself was arrested and extradited to the United States. The 2 former partners followed the same timetable, with one exception. Carlos was facing a much harsher sentence. So severe, in fact, that a few weeks after his arrest, the Miami Herald reported that Carlos Lehder had written a letter to U.S. President George W. Bush offering his full cooperation. He was going to hand over all the information he could about the Medellin cartel for the sake of his freedom. George Jung learned of this and finally agreed to testify against Carlos Lehder. It was not only George's decision. He was also asked to do so by Pablo Escobar himself. Carlos Lehder, who had once betrayed George and wanted to betray Escobar, would now pay the price. He was sentenced to life without parole and another 135 years. For him, it was the end. But the prison sentence was not the end of Boston George after all. He was soon released. Life didn't seem to teach George anything. He soon returned to his old ways. It wasn't so much that he wanted money. He just wanted adventure again. He was bored without a job. In 1994, he revived his old business by contacting one of the pilots he'd worked with in the 60s while still doing marijuana. The pilot was a friend of George's and didn't mind getting involved in the new business and making some money. The reunion of the old friends should have gone successfully, but there was one but. The pilot friend worked for the Drug Enforcement Administration. The rest was just like in the movie. A perfectly executed cocaine smuggling operation ended in another imprisonment for Boston George. In this case, he became the odd one out. The Drug Enforcement Administration needed to catch a big fish, so the whole operation was pre-planned, and the old buddy just ended up being a tool to catch the real culprit. George Jung had smuggled drugs countless times, always managing to get away, and if he did get caught, he served very little time in prison. This time, it was different. Boston George was caught red-handed. This was not the few ounces of cocaine he had been caught with the last time. George was caught with 1,754 pounds, 796 kilograms of cocaine in a stolen plane. George was facing the rest of his life in prison. Before George Jung was sentenced, he spoke openly with the judge. The judge was surprised. You had $100 million, and nobody knew who you were. You didn't need anything else. Why didn't you just leave? George had a lot of money, but didn't want to stop. He liked the risk, his job, and the vibrant, free life. Initially, he was in it for the money, but when he had a lot of it, he just didn't care about it anymore. George wasn't addicted to cocaine. He was addicted to his lifestyle. He received a severe sentence for his addiction, 60 years in prison. At that time, George was 54 years old. Was it all worth such a sentence? But Boston George didn't have to die in prison. His sentence was reduced for good behavior. He served 20 years and was released on June 2, 2014. Even though his beloved daughter never visited him in prison, apparently they were still able to build a relationship after his release. The remarkable movie Blow made George Jung a star. There was one very good line in that movie. Life passes most people by while they're making grand plans for it. Boston George's story is striking in that he had a full, bright, and not-so-bad life for someone who gets into this sort of thing. He was in prison twice before age 54 and got only minor sentences both times. He didn't have to lose loved ones. He didn't have to get shot. He didn't have to be in jail all the time since he was young. And, after all, he didn't get killed. Compared to other cocaine dealers, he had a pretty good life. But was he satisfied with his life? The answer was found in one of his interviews. "We live as we die, alone. And even though I spent 20 years in prison, a few other years incarcerated here and there, I've had so many great experiences in my life of living total free will that I wouldn't change it for all the gold in the earth." George Jung died on May 5, 2021, at the age of 78. Even though he was a drug dealer, still, thanks for the blow, George.